thank you for joining us today.
An enormous pleasure.
So, I had prepared a list of questions, but stuff happened overnight, and I have to ask you about them.
Of course.
So I woke up to the news this morning. Our top news of the top page says Israel might be preparing for a potential strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. You were not just the former deputy prime minister in the UK, but you're also the foreign secretary for a period of time. Tell us, put that hat on and tell us, you woke up to this news. A, how would you react? How would you interpret it? And what do you think is going to happen next?
Look, it's a great question and a great pleasure to be here. Do you know what my instinctive answer, and this is always terrible to say it to a news organisation, is I'd be very careful about reading too much into headlines. Particularly in the Middle East, where the structural tectonic plates take a time to shift. I don't think actually it's news that Israel is contemplating that. It's been contemplating it for years. Equally, the news overnight, much recorded in the media, has been the Iranian response that they didn't expect much over negotiations with the US side. So I see it as a little bit of the phony diplomatic war or engagement before we get down to brass tacks. I think an underlying strategic question is whether Iran and the US can find an overlap of win-win. And that is not just related to the nuclear question. And when I was Foreign Secretary in the aftermath, both of the US administration under Trump pulling out of the JCPOA and under the Biden administration, we grappled with that issue. It's not just that, it's also support for proxies, it's also other activity around, for example, harrying of shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. And the question is quite what would be the price on both sides for some kind of reconciliation. A lot is made about the US administration under President Trump being very transactional. I suspect actually, in this context, in the search for some kind of lasting win-win, it's not actually a bad instinct to have.
So let me just try and make sure that I've interpreted it correctly. Are you interpreting this leak as a potential leak from the US to put pressure on Iran as they talk about the nuclear deal with Iran?
I think before any substantive diplomacy, there tends to be a little bit that leaks out into the media. Who knows where it comes from? I also know better than to judge that. But I thought it was interesting on the Iranian side, the message is we don't really think they're serious. And on the Israeli side, you better believe we're serious.
Okay.
I read it in those terms.
That is fascinating. And that's absolutely fascinating. I was talking to our lead geoeconomic analyst for MENA, and she had the same view as you. So
I must be right.
You must be right. Yeah, two intelligent people telling me the same thing.
I'll tell you about that.
Let me ask you about the world more broadly. And again, putting your former top UK diplomat hat on, how do you see the world today? So we had a unipolar world led by the US since the early 1990s. Do you see the world staying in that unipolar world? Do you see us shifting to a bipolar world where the US and China are almost equal? Do you see us moving to a multipolar world where possibly we have the US, China, maybe Europe, maybe India, maybe Russia, Japan? Where do you see the world is heading?
Look, it's a great question. We're certainly well beyond the bipolar world of the Cold War. I think the unipolar moment in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War seems to have subsided. And by the way, in all sorts of ways, that's a good thing. If you look at the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods infrastructure, the GATT, which then became the World Trade Organization, the whole point of the US approach was out of enlightened self-interest to open up and integrate the world economy. And it was felt, whether this now feels naive or not, that that would create more global peace and stability within which everyone would gain. I think two things have happened. On the one hand, billions of people have been taken out of poverty under that open global trading system. I personally have always been a free trader, think it's great news. The second thing that's happened is there weren't much in the rules about transition. So as China, India, the Gulf, other so-called emerging economies have emerged and are now taking a larger chunk of GDP and trade with all this mercantilist emphasis on trade surpluses, the US is saying, well, hold on, those rules maybe need to be adjusted. Whether it's the World Bank loans or the preferential trade rules, which allow greater subsidies and protectionism and higher tariffs to protect vulnerable countries. Is that right in this age? Particularly then, when China is availing itself of all the tools of a command economy. And I say this dispassionately without casting judgment, because I think a lot of people look at the new Trump administration and think it is cataclysmic change. I think actually it's much more a catalysm for a change that was long underway and probably pretty foreseeable. And that's what we see most obviously through the tariffs and the trade tensions.
And just in terms of these tensions that you've talked about, so we're seeing these tensions between the US and China. How should the UK position itself? Should it follow the US lead in curbing investments and technology transfer to China, or should it have its own independent path towards that?
So, look, I'm a free trader. I'm obviously not the same political party as the current government, but I always like to look at these things dispassionately and want the UK to do well. I've got to say, I think in a number of respects, what Keir Starmer and the government has done are right. Lent in with the US and said, let's get tariffs down. I think that gives us a comparative advantage in Europe and hopefully tees up a future FTA. It's protecting particularly steel and cars. I think more interesting for me, and when I was Foreign Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, our government signed up to CPTPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement everyone will know, from Malaysia to Mexico. I think that's a huge opportunity. We also started the India FTA negotiations. That now is coming to fruition. I think the opportunities are going to be in the East. We also, the next on the list was an FTA with the Gulf and the GCC countries. I think that would be a really smart move. The most interesting player in all of this for me, and I say this again, not sort of backing a horse or a country or this, but I think what Vietnam has done is extraordinary. So Vietnam, subject to potential tariffs, very high, has always balanced itself well between the US and China. Like the Gulf, has said, okay, I tell you what, we'll liberalize almost entirely. How about that? That's a smart gambit. And by the way, we'll build a Trump Tower in the capital. I think that's a smart move. And it's not cutting its ties with China. I don't think you'd see Vietnam do that. But also making it clear that across, counter to this protectionist trade, there are global free trade opportunities. I think that's exactly where the United Kingdom, with a service-dominated economy, should be.
And you mentioned that the UK should move east, but obviously it has historical and geographic ties with its nearest neighbor, which is Europe. I'm sure that took a lot of your bandwidth while you were Foreign Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister. What did you conclude in terms of the ideal relationship between the UK and the EU? How should that be?
Well, I was Brexit Secretary as well, and so my views are well known. But look, I always wanted us to leave the EU as a political club to be a better European neighbour. My father was a Czech refugee, and my wife is from Brazil, so I take a globalist view, but I feel very much European. So I'm not sure about this current deal. I think we've traded a lot for dynamic alignment. No other country in the world gives up control over their regulatory authority in relation to market access. The EU doesn't do it. So personally, that's a very heavy price, even in a small sector, particularly agriculture. And food. Actually, the EU exports 3 times as much to us as we export to them on the ag side. Not quite sure why we therefore need to sign up to their rules. Having said that, I'm not against, in principle, a youth mobility scheme, and I would certainly like to see tensions reduce. The EU is our biggest market, for sure. It's just not the growth sector for the future. So what I want to do is the smart move, I think, is to try and stabilise that relationship. I think particularly on the security front, we can show that we can add value, be that better neighbour, that better ally, but also take all of the opportunities in the Gulf, in the Indo-Pacific that there are, which is where the jobs and the investment are going to come from in the next 30 years.
And let's talk about the region that we're in now, the Gulf. You mentioned that at the time when you were in the government, you were thinking about a free trade agreement with the Gulf. What do you think the strategic relationship between the UK and the Gulf should be as the future moves?
So I look at it in a number of ways, but in security terms, it's always been a high-trust partner. Diplomatically very agile. I thought you put it very well, if I may say so. Will not pick between sides. Now, of course, when you're dealing with acutely tense issues, you always want countries to come and back you. But on the other hand, the Gulf has had a great mediation position and availed itself of that, and we've seen that in relation to Israel and the Palestinian issue over time. And I think that's one of its comparative advantages. You also have high and deep and wide investment capabilities. I've actually been doing a little tour across the Gulf and talking to sovereign wealth funds and private investors. So you have a lot of the things that the world needs and which the UK wants. I'm very focused on critical minerals. I know we'll come and talk about that. But there's an interesting place in the supply chain conundrum, whether it's critical minerals or otherwise, for the Gulf. And so I think I see it as a high trust partner that takes a long-term view. And I think amidst all of the short-term froth and uncertainty, that's very valuable for the UK and more generally.
And what can the Gulf give the UK, and what can the UK give the Gulf in that exchange?
Well, I think, it's a good way of looking at it. Again, we're talking in transactional terms, and there's nothing wrong with enlightened self-interest and win-win. Look, I think investment, supply chain security. I think the obvious thing, again, I'm thinking a lot about minerals and metals. I work for the World Gold Council as well as for Appian Capital. But if you look at that supply chain security, the Gulf is in an interesting place, partly because your investment funds and your ability to invest in the region, but partly also the ability to invest abroad. I think one of the interesting things going on in the United States, and one of the things I do, is chair a group of equity investors that advise the US policymakers it's bipartisan under successive administrations, on supply chain security in the critical minerals space. And there's a lot of talk in the US about onshoring, for sure in the critical mineral sector, but also others. There's going to need to be a lot more friendshoring. And that means investing in often non-aligned jurisdictions in order to create the supply chain security and the offtake, whether it's into the Gulf or to the US or to the UK. I think there's a really interesting space for the Gulf in that. Exim Bank, which is the US Import-Export Bank, has now finally shifted its mandate to invest abroad in projects which can bring offtake and jobs into the US under the so-called Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. Again, if you look at that, if that's the future, really interesting space for the Gulf.
And if we talk about the geopolitics of critical minerals and rare earths, so why are they important to begin with? And also a related question, we know about there's a deal between the US and Ukraine.
Yes.
How do you interpret that deal? Do you think it's beneficial for both sides, or do you think it's more one-sided and extractive?
So to quote Bloomberg, in terms of demand, we need something like $2 to $3 trillion more investment in mining in this space, critical minerals and rare earths, if we're going to meet our energy needs. That means investing more and doing more mining in the next 30 years than we've done in the last 70,000, just to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge. Why do we need it? We need it for the cobalt in our smartphones, for the lithium in our EV cars, for the graphite in data centers. So if you think of AI and the increasing demand for AI, where's the energy in the data centers going to come from? Big emphasis on nuclear power, so uranium is going to be important. So I think in all of these senses, when the demand is exponential. Against that, you've got a chokehold of supply. The market is so concentrated. So to give you a historical reference point, if you think back to the Yom Kippur War, where commodities really impacted on geopolitics, in 1974, the four biggest oil and gas producers, something like 11 to 26% of supply each. If you look at critical minerals and rare earths, the supply concentration in China's hands is 60% for rare earths, 70% graphite, even more if you include refining and processing. So chokehold of supply against exponential demand, we need to find alternative supply chains that are protected from tariffs to one degree, but also export restrictions. And I think that's the space where it's becoming very interesting. I've never heard a US administration talk so much about critical minerals and rare earths. It's a good thing. You asked about Ukraine. Look, Ukraine has got graphite, lithium, rare earths. It's certainly got a range of deposits. Quite how accessible they are, quite a lot of the rare earths are in hotspots like the Donbass, is open to question. And a lot of the information is out of date, so there's a lot of due diligence. But the idea in principle of, we talked about win-win deals, which binds the US in to a lasting peace in Ukraine in return for the investment to do the reconstruction and development that then feeds the supply chain security and critical minerals that the West needs. Seems a pretty smart move to me. We were asked for advice about it, and we again are asked by governments, not just investors, about this space. And we said, look, there's a lot of detail left to be done. But whether it's the Ukraine, there's a lot of talk about Greenland, DRC, we need to wake up to this because Western supply chains and indeed global supply chains are 20 years behind China, and that market is very concentrated, and our OEMs have not woken up to what this will mean for them in 10 years' time.
So given their importance in geopolitics, for energy transition, for defense, who's winning the race in this rare earths and critical minerals? It sounds like what you said is that China seems to be to these rare critical minerals and rare earths. It's like Saudi Arabia to oil. It's like Qatar to gas. Is that a fair sort of reflection?
Yeah, even more than those. I definitely. And I mean, not just within China, which is an accident of geography, but if you take DRC, which is known for its copper and cobalt, copper exponentially in demand, cobalt in the way I described earlier, something like 19 of the mines, 17 are now Chinese owned. You look at a similar situation for nickel in Indonesia. The question, though, I mean, China's been smart. It's engaged in all sorts of Belt and Road and economic subsidies for this. So there's a massive capex problem for the West in competing for investment. But it's been smart, and it's been at this for 20 years, and it's all this coming. Now, certainly Western liberal democracies, but also other countries, tend to be poor in taking that longer-term view. So we're on catch-up. But the question is, how do we put together those positive supply chains? We need to answer the capital conundrum. We need a lot more friendshoring. A lot of talk about onshoring. We need a lot more friendshoring. And that's a place where we're experts. So with Appian Capital, we invest in not just critical minerals and rare earths, but the supply chain security. And the question is whether we can have better public-private partnerships with an investor lens like the one we bring, but also the kind of friendshoring. And again, I come back to this point, which is why we're all here. Actually, the Gulf is an interesting place to combine those comparative advantages. And that's the way you build the alternative supply chains, create greater stability and greater growth.
Given how far China is in this race, is there any chance or hope of catching up?
Of course, I'm always stubborn optimist about these things. But we need to get going on this, and we need to make it a race to the top in terms of environmental, social, and government standards. And we need to deliver. There's a lot of talk about this, but can we deliver? And that's why the public-private partnership is so important. We've delivered 12 mining projects into production at Appian in the last 8 years, or since 2016. That's more than the 5 biggest mining companies combined. So I always say people want to look for the big, the US administration talk about the big exponential deals. Actually, what you want to create is a virtuous cycle around these elements, public-private partnership, friendshoring, that starts to create the tide shifting back in the West's favour. Now, no one expects the Gulf to choose between China and the US, but actually you're well placed to take advantage of the demand for alternative supply chains here in the region. And that's certainly the message I've had from Riyadh, from the UAE and here in Qatar.
Final question, going back to the world, going back to the UK, going back to what's happening in the global environment. Historically, the UK, the United Kingdom, thrived when there's a world where there is peace, there is trade, and there is a lot of trade and limited tariffs. We're moving to a different world. More conflicts, higher tariffs, and more fragmentation. Can the United Kingdom still thrive in this?
Do you know what? It feels to me quite like a Palmerstonian era of fragmentation and fluidity. And Palmerston was famous for saying there are no eternal allies, only eternal interests. Now, I don't think we're quite as devoid of values in this era as that might suggest. But for a mid-sized country with a service-dominated economy, whose comparative advantages are financial services, tech, AI, life sciences as well, I think there are huge opportunities against the protectionist tide. But I always say you can't jump a ditch in 2 leaps. We've got to go for it, and we've got to lean in. And I would certainly encourage that.
Dominic Raab, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts.
Thank you.